Welcome to another edition of ExchangeWire Voxpop. Today we've got Raina from StackAdapt in the office to do a run through today's topic, which is on unlocking B2B marketing success with programmatic account-based marketing. Raina, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How about yourself?
I'm very well. Before we get into it, can you tell us what you do at StackAdapt and a little bit more about StackAdapt as well, please?
Yeah, so I'm a sales director at StackAdapt. StackAdapt is a DSP, which is a demand-side platform in the programmatic landscape. We do multi-channel marketing across all industries. I have a little bit more of a background in the B2B space. Before StackAdapt, I was at another DSP, which focused on kind of contextual and B2B advertising specifically. So that's been my bread and butter for the last few years. Focusing on the UK market since we opened up our presence in 2021 here. And then in the last year, I've specifically been focusing on the French market as well. So hopefully lots of fun stuff to talk about today.
Great, and we're talking about an interesting part of the marketing advertising world, which sometimes gets overlooked by ad tech, which is B2B marketing. And it boggles my mind how very, very little is done around this space. There's huge amounts of money in it, but it's obviously mired in complexity, etc., around privacy in Europe and other things. But let's talk about what you're seeing in the B2B market, specifically around account-based marketing. So let's talk about the lay of the land in the B2B space.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to just start off by just defining what B2B programmatic is, talk a little bit more about what makes up the landscape, and then we can kind of go into like growth of B2B and specifically ABM as well. So when we're talking about B2B programmatic, essentially we're just talking about the automated and data-driven buying process of ads that are specifically targeted towards businesses instead of kind of individual consumers. The things that kind of make up this landscape, automation, obviously I've just mentioned that already, typically led by AI or machine learning based softwares. Data, there's tons of data out there, so anything from kind of behavioral data, contextual data, firmographic data when we're talking about the B2B space, technographic data, which is what kind of technologies businesses are using. So that's usually what's driving the campaign activations. When we're talking about the actual ad inventory or the placements, environments that we're in, those will usually be kind of ad inventory that are on sites that are typically for business users most of the time. Obviously, business B2B audiences are people too, so they're not always just in those business environments. In terms of how that kind of buying and selling is happening, there's two main ways that this is happening. So that's either in the open auction, which is, I always just like to compare that to like an open house, right? Everyone's allowed in, everyone's bidding on the same stuff, highest bidder will win. Or the other type, which is really important in the B2B space, is private marketplaces or PMPs, which is kind of by invitation only. Just gives you a little bit more access to those exclusive premium business sites. And then the kind of formats that we're talking about, there's multiple channels available. So just like kind of the consumer space, you've got social media platforms, you've got email marketing, you've got display, native, connected TV, audio, in-game. I do get some raised eyebrows when I talk about in-game to B2B marketers sometimes, but there is sometimes a case for that in those B2B marketing campaigns. And then, of course, a really big component to the programmatic landscape, especially for B2B, is kind of attribution and analytical tools. Being able to track those campaigns, making sure they're working, and then kind of all of the insights that all of that data that we're using can help, come from those campaigns.
What's the impediment then? What's the biggest barrier for people trying to get into B2B programmatic? Like, so we touched on it, I think, before this conversation that privacy is a big issue around this, and in the US, you don't seem to have that same problem. So is that a problem in terms of scale? Like, you talked about, PMPs on these business sites, but does that actually scale, like, from a buyer's point of view?
Yeah, so it really depends. I would say definitely sometimes, again, when we talk about B2B marketing or you're talking to a marketer who wants to run their campaigns, they always want to be in like really specific trade sites, right? That are usually a little bit smaller. There's less ad space. So it can be really competitive, a little bit more expensive to get there. If that kind of runs out, right, it can kind of cause issues with scalability. The big thing is mainly just privacy and kind of the cookie deprecation. So a lot of solutions have been cookie-based, and that's really taking a hit in Europe. In the US in general, that is changing with laws like CCPA, but in general, there's just way more data available that can be activated, a little bit more interoperability between all the platforms, things like that. But I think the main barrier for B2B marketers, to be perfectly honest, for programmatic is the complexity of programmatic. There's all these different acronyms, all these different tools, all these different platforms. The landscape is really busy, and I think sometimes that can just be really complicated and scary, and if you don't really know where to start, right, there's just so much information to have to kind of learn. But you know, that's where hopefully teams like StackAdapt or people like me who come in the industry can help and advise.
And are you making that cut through then? Are those people, like, are the buyers seeing the opportunity now by leveraging a platform like yourselves?
Yeah, definitely. So talking about the growth of B2B programmatic, there's actually two stats that kind of explain why we're seeing so much growth here. So one of them I think is from McKinsey, that might be wrong, so maybe fact check me. But one of those stats is that by the year 2024, 50% of B2B ads are going to be in the digital ad space. So there's kind of one obvious outlier to where that's come from. Obviously, coronavirus led to a huge shift in consumption habits. And that was a big one for the B2B industry. So before coronavirus, you know, digital was obviously a thing, but practically overnight, a lot of those activities that were kind of events-based or in-person meetings, which is a big component of B2B marketing, pretty much had to completely change and pivot totally to the digital ad space. But the other aspect of that is also the second stat, which is, and I hope I don't get this wrong, it's in 2023, 50% of B2B ads will be served on mobile, which is really strange. I actually saw that and I was like, I wasn't expecting to see that. And I think the way to look at that or understand it is that, again, sometimes we talk to B2B marketers and they have this idea of a B2B audience as being this corporate robot who's constantly in their office, on their desktop, just reading business sites. And that's just not true. Like, B2B audiences are real people at the end of the day.
You're broadening the conversation beyond just typical trade publications or B2B sites. You're saying that these people are doing other stuff on other sites. Why would we not apply that capability outside of these traditional B2B publications?
There's so many different ways of consuming content, and yes, we can still stay on those business sites for sure, right? But if someone is, I actually really love listening to industry podcasts, right? So if people wanted to target me, the best way to kind of stand out would probably be to have a pretty cool audio ad within that
ExchangeWire's podcast, yes, weekly.
You'll get me as a lead. So it's kind of just moving away from the traditional, you know, we have to just do kind of desktop, you know, mobile. People are consuming content in different ways, and especially in the B2B side of things, we're kind of seeing those consumption habits being more aligned with how the consumer side of things happens. So I just think, you know, again, more people are online. We also just live in a very digitalized world. There's just more and more ad inventory online across different devices and across different like forms of content. So I think what B2B marketers are realizing is that, you know, if they're not in all of those spaces, they're essentially allowing their competitors to take over those spaces and get that share price.
So let's shift the conversation to an acronym that B2B marketers do understand: account-based management. Account-based marketing. Even I don't understand it so clearly. But it'd be good to get a kind of an understanding of what it is and why it's so important for the B2B space, because you anchor quite a lot around it. So let's do a definition first before we go into the sort of values and benefits of ABM.
Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this one succinct because I do tend to ramble, but essentially account-based marketing is a go-to-market strategy that targets very specific accounts or companies through synchronized activities from both a marketing and sales perspective in order to engage with those accounts or companies through that buyer journey. So starting from that kind of first touch point, making them aware of your brand, all the way down to the lead gen activity to kind of capture that lead, all the way down to, you've got that customer, now you want to retain them. And you can do that through ABM strategies.
Right, and then the benefits then to B2B marketing from ABM, and we'll talk about how you apply that in your sort of media buying strategy, programmatic buying strategy. But why is it so important? And what are the benefits for the B2B market?
Yeah, so if executed properly, definitely there's definitely a lot of things to kind of think about to set up an ABM strategy. But when it does work properly, it can improve your ROI, right? You can just get more bang for your buck out of those strategies. Can help improve those client sales relationships. So again, through all those insights that you're gaining, at the account level from your activities, that can really empower your sales teams to just get to know, those accounts better, what they need, what they're looking for, what resonates with them. Same for marketing, right? That can inform your marketing campaigns. Shortened sales cycles. B2B is notorious for long sales cycles, which, that's just kind of inevitable because there's many stakeholders involved. They're usually larger purchase decisions that have to be made.
Big price items as well,
Big price items. So hopefully, something that an ABM strategy can help with is, especially with those really target or key accounts, if it's working properly and they're getting kind of that information that they can get, hopefully you would start to see that sales cycle shorten, at least for those target accounts that you've been, kind of going after. And then obviously, the ultimate goal is to just increase revenue in general.
So from a programmatic perspective, how do you integrate programmatic tactics into your ABM strategies? Like, so how does that even work? Because you were talking about, like, it seems like it's in micro-targeting effectively. How do you make that work beyond the trade sites and B2B sites? Give us a sense of how a marketer could start on the journey.
So I'm going to just take a little bit of a step back as well and just kind of, I've defined account-based marketing, but there's some kind of key frameworks or principles for ABM, which I think for anyone who hasn't done ABM and they want to get started, these are kind of the things that you need to think about first before you go ahead and activate that. So that first one will be marketing sales alignment, right? You need to really make sure both the sales team and marketing teams and really all teams in a company, right, are aware of your business goals, your objectives, who those target accounts are, what content and offers you have for those target accounts, and then kind of what that buyer journey is going to look like once you manage to kind of get those accounts in. So that's one thing to kind of just make sure there's alignment. Once there's alignment there, you want to create that target account list, right? Which accounts are you going to go after? What's the kind of global purchasing power for the product and service that you have? How much of that is in your addressable market? How much of that addressable market is already in your database, right? You can actively go after them. And once you've kind of established that, you can look at, okay, short-term goals. How are we going to get those target accounts to kind of move through that sales cycle? Long-term goals, how are we going to grow that database that we have and grow the account list that we want to go after? So that's one key thing. And then again, just making sure that the, just knowing what that kind of user journey is going to look like once you have made that sale, just to make sure, that you're giving them a very nice customer experience. So those are kind of the things that you want to just make sure as a business you're pretty solid on. Once you have all of that information, then you can kind of go out and start picking your tools.
Right.
When you're looking for tools, that's where you want to be aware of their limitations, right? Is it going to be able to scale in the market that we're going to be working on?
Yes.
Are we going to be able to see the analytics at an account level? Are there any other parameters that we can kind of get insights into? So for example, in the US, where it's just much easier to do, you can see at an account level, but you can also see, at a seniority level, who's kind of been looking at your ads, things like that. So you want to kind of really question the tools that you're going to be using. And then again, from an attribution perspective, just be very aware of how those tools are attributing success, if they're aligned with, you know, your other platforms' attribution models. You know, you just want to make sure you know what kind of analytics you'll be getting from those tools.
Oh, okay. We touched on it there a few minutes ago around being able to kind of like scale campaigns beyond your typical B2B sites, because that's kind of like route one for most marketers. Just talk about how you sort of use a diverse range of channels, right? Because you talked about in-gaming, that's quite interesting. Running ads on like soccer games around the hoardings and stuff, and then other channels. Just talk about how you're weaving them into the strategies of the B2B market. And they'll be going, well, I don't really, that's the mind boggles from their perspective because they've never done it before.
Yeah.
But how do you do that effectively? Because like you've got all these different channels. How do you bring that together from an attribution point of view and even a targeting point of view? Like, so I'm curious how you guys are approaching that.
So I'm going to wear my StackAdapt hat here for a second. So there are platforms out there that you can kind of have access to all of these channels. You also have partners who can help you do ABM. Obviously, StackAdapt is one of them. I have to say I would not be doing my job properly if I didn't. So that's one thing, right? There are platforms where you can, rather than kind of doing all these channels differently in different places, it's a good idea to think about, you know, how can you actually bring all of this into one place? But once you do have access to all these channels, it's, again, kind of thinking about that end user and moving away from just seeing them as that kind of B2B business, like corporate robot, right? Again, these are people. What channels might they be consuming at what time of day? So once you do kind of wrap your head around the multi-channel aspect of a marketing campaign, what channels are you going to use and why? So each channel has its own benefit. Things like video, CTV, audio, they're very impactful, right? You can either have a really visual way of telling your brand story or, you know, through listening. So that's a really good one for kind of brand awareness. So maybe you want to start with that. Maybe you want to move on to the kind of engagement side of things. Native is really powerful for any kind of engagement campaigns because you can, you know, just educate the audience a little bit more on your products, or again, if there's specific things about your brand that you want your audience to know, that's a powerful channel. And then obviously display is an obvious one that tends to be the workhorse of the B2B campaigns, the ones that are usually used to kind of push those lead gen campaigns and things like that. But I think sometimes we tend to steer away from things like CTV, audio, video, because it's just not seen as that kind of display lead generation campaign. But you can't have a lead generation campaign if nobody knows who your brand is, right? So you have to start with brand awareness tactics.
Right.
And those are kind of the channels that will help you do it.
Okay, so you're almost trying to change a mindset from a marketer's point of view. So do you use current tried and tested audience targeting tactics in B2B and apply it into programmatic? Just talk about, because I imagine like when you talk to a B2B marketer going, why am I advertising in gaming? Why am I advertising in CTV? Like what's you put a fairly logical argument forward that these people have lives outside of when they leave the office, right? Nobody's all, you know, the people read football sites and they might be reading ad tech sites at the same time. But I'm curious to know if you're using stuff that they understand and applying that to programmatic. And can you give us an idea of how, you know, that works together?
So just some of the kind of like main targeting tactics.
Yeah,
that
basically
that
they can. Yeah, so they can say, oh, I get it, right? But you're just applying that to a wider. Diverse channels. Just talk about that.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point because I think sometimes we talk about the channels and again you kind of get the like glazed
100%.
look,
I can imagine
the main thing is the targeting, right? Yeah. So you can apply most of this targeting to these channels. So this might be long, but some of the main targeting tactics that I see on most B2B campaigns, a really big one, and especially recently, is first-party targeting. Third-party cookies are getting deprecated, and also just with GDPR.
They don't work on Safari and Firefox, and
you gotta figure something out if you haven't already. So first-party data is a big one, but also really understanding like how that can actually be used and activated. So That can be used to run retention campaigns for like your existing customer database, right? If you want to upsell them, or, you know, again, we live in a very competitive world. Just because you've won a customer doesn't mean they'll stay with you, so you got to stay in front of them. You can exclude your existing customers if you want to try and focus on, you know, gaining share of voice and just increasing that audience. Or you can do something really cool, which this is pretty interesting from an ABM perspective, is using that first-party data to expand your audience and create a lookalike audience.
Right. So modeling out existing data, probabilistic modeling. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just looking at attributes and being able to target, you know, either users with similar attributes, or even from an ABM perspective, right? We've found our target list of accounts, but what if there are other accounts that we haven't identified that actually have very similar attributes to our target accounts? Maybe we want to add them into our ABM list. So that's something you can probably pull from your first-party data. Contextual targeting is another big one. Again, cookie deprecation, GDPR laws, things like that. If you need to find a way to target users without relying on data, you've got to start thinking about contextual, and there's different ways to think about it. So there's some more kind of granular tools, which will either look at like the semantics of some keywords to understand the context of a placement, or you can do very specific keyword matching. For example, if you have a really niche product in the B2B world and you can't find any data segments, that's a really good one to use, because more often than not, it will actually just be people, you know, working in that industry who will probably be consuming content relating to those products. But then just larger, wider contextual triggers, right? Where does your audience work? London has a really great example with bank, which is where most bankers work. If that's your target audience, maybe you want to do some digital out-of-home campaigns in that environment to kind of reach them on their commute, right? Without actually tapping into those database segments.
Yeah. So you can look at the location in specific cities, like, so we're on like Hatton Garden, which is just all jewelers. I don't know what you want to advertise, maybe some like,
I don't know.
diamond cutting equipment.
Or just on the commute, right? Like getting the commuter belts, transport hubs, right? So obviously that's a little bit more one-to-many. So again, sometimes you talk about that and B2B marketers get a little bit nervous, but that's an awareness play, right? That's where you need to widen up the reach a little bit to increase that awareness. On the topic of location, another big one that I've seen is location targeting, or sometimes called like radius targeting, where you, now that the world is kind of more back to normal and we do have in-person events, being able to target a specific location where those events are happening, and then being able to retarget that audience at a later date. And then of course the big one is third-party targeting, right? Those cookies aren't deprecated just yet, so we do still have access to third-party segments, and that's kind of where the ABM targeting can come into play. Those are usually powered by partners, right? So at StackAdapt's for Europe, we power with lead forensics, which is based on IP addresses, which is why we can scale. And in the US, we work with Dun & Bradstreet as a kind of third-party partner that helps power our ABM targeting.
In terms of the measurement piece of this, right? So it's all well and good kind of putting your campaign to work. I'm just curious about, you know, how do you measure success in ABM strategies? Like what key metrics do you use? And then how does that apply to what you guys are doing around the programmatic space? So let's just do two separate questions there. So the first one, how do you measure the success of EBM? Yep.
So typically, again, it will depend on those limitations of the tracking tools that you can use. What can you actually see from a reporting perspective? Obviously, if you're going to be doing an ABM campaign, you probably want to have insights at least at an account level. And the things you'll probably start off by looking at is, other than kind of conversions and revenue, but that will be impressions, right? Reach. Are you reaching enough users in those accounts? And engagement, clicks. Once they are on your site, can you see how long or what they're engaging with? And the really cool things that you can take from those metrics is, let's say you have a list of 20 accounts, you're reaching 5 of them, they're taking the bulk of your budget, you're satisfied that they're engaging well, right? But the rest of the 15 accounts aren't really performing well. how can we improve that? Is it the messaging that we're sending to those accounts that aren't resonating, or do we need to change the creatives up? So these are all kind of metrics you can look at, but then use to kind of enrich that ABM strategy further.
Okay. And from a programmatic point of view, how does that sort of apply? Like, what sort of, you know, those measurement pieces, how do you make those programmatic campaigns work? Because I'm obviously, like, I'd say most B2B marketers haven't really done a lot of programmatic, I expect, and it's kind of like a whole new area for them. Like, so how do you make them comfortable with that in terms of the measurement? Actually, it'd be interesting to know what your steps into getting those people to that point. Like, what's the first step in terms of like getting marketers, B2B marketers, looking beyond their tried and tested sort of strategies?
I mean, I think a very obvious one is also just talking to them about it. I mean, a lot of the time they just don't even know what can be done, right? So if there's an example of one, even just showing them an example of what a report could look like, right. Or, you know, give me your top 20 accounts and I'll show you what that looks like from an actual scalable segment. How can we reach them? I think just talking about it sometimes can get people excited, and then also talking to them about those channels or those targeting tactics that they might not know about can usually kind of get them.
I mean, I imagine most B2B marketers are kind of like, they use LinkedIn as a sort of like brand building, and then they use email as their lower funnel. Like, so you're coming in with something completely different. Like, look, you're overspending or over-indexing in LinkedIn. There is a huge opportunity to target your users in these different channels, and there's a bit of, you're increasing your chances of brand building first of all, and then leading down the funnel.
Exactly, yeah, and you know, don't come for me, LinkedIn. I would never suggest not doing LinkedIn.
No, you can't.
Right?
But
you got to do that as well. But it's more thinking about, okay, if you're just doing LinkedIn and email, there are other players who are doing
the same,
multi-channel, doing emails, LinkedIn, are on CTV. I mean, if you walk in King's Cross, you'll see tons of digital out-of-home banners.
Well, if you walk down the Elizabeth line down the Farringdon, you can see the B2B ads.
Yeah.
Then like, you're going, wow, that's interesting.
So I think that's like the first thing to kind of call out is, you know, if you're not doing it, other people are. And again, just, you know, once you do kind of have a successful example, is just kind of showing that there's, you know, proof in the pudding. Right?
Yeah.
I've talked about this for years, but there's a reason, right? Sometimes you can run a campaign that doesn't work, right? But that's still a positive thing. You can still take learnings from that and then use that for improving your next campaigns.
Have you been surprised by any specific channel that's worked really well? Like the campaigns as you run? I'm just curious because it's just a curveball question here. Like, but like, is there like a channel go, wow, like for B2B marketers going, well, I didn't expect that. That's pretty cool.
So there is actually one example that stands out. We actually did, and it was an awareness campaign. It was audio. So things like audio, CTV, they tend to be better for awareness because you can't click on the ads, right? So you can't, typically if someone's like, we want to do a lead gen campaign on audio, right? Yeah. We're probably going to say, let's do audio, but then we'll retarget with display, right? And that's probably where we're going to count those conversions. Yeah. Awareness is more about increasing that reach, increasing awareness, things like that. There was a campaign that we did where we did an audio campaign actually in Australia. Yeah. And they were only measuring the success by looking at awareness metrics. They weren't kind of saying we need to see all these conversions coming through specifically from the audio campaign. Yeah. But I was chatting to the client and they're like, oh, we were having a sales call with this lead, and they specifically called out the audio ad that they heard listening to that
radio
podcast.
Ads work, they really do.
Which I was like, that's amazing, because that's a tough one to be able to track, but it was really nice to hear because, you know, I was just very pleased by that. Because I say all the time, the awareness stuff leads to lead gen, takes a little bit longer, but that was one that I was pretty happy about. Okay,
we'll sign off with one final question. One bit of advice to B2B marketers who are looking at this and are a little bit apprehensive. What's your advice to them? Because obviously there's an opportunity here, like where did it start on the journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have three pieces of advice probably. Going back to that framework, really take your time figuring that stuff out, I think, as a business, between the teams, and make sure there's alignment. That's really key before kind of activating anything. Second piece of advice, don't be afraid of channels that are new to you. And if you are, go seek out, obviously come talk to me if you want to, but there are other experts in the industry as well. There's a lot of people who've been doing this for a long time who, know what they're talking about and can help. And then third piece of advice, I say this all the time, but really understand your attribution models, how they're working for you. If you're using multiple platforms, are those attribution models aligned? If they're not, that's okay, but just understand what that discrepancy should look like.
Yeah.
Have fun looking at the analytics. There's a lot of information that can come out of it. So.
And analytics can be fun.
Yes.
And on that geeky note, we'll finish up. Thank you for your time today.
No, thank you for having me.
And that run through the ABM piece of B2B marketing. And that was ExchangeWire Voxpop, and we will see you next time.